last week and today. Next week we'll take a pause because I'm going to be out of town at my brother-in-law's funeral in Denver. So Kevin will be here on Sunday, so we won't have our Bible study. And then the 2 weeks after that, we will return to some themes and, some themes from the Gospel of John. So we won't go through the book anymore. We'll finish that today, but then we'll take a look at some of the broader themes that are in there, using a couple of the videos from the Bible Project. So, last week we looked at the first half of the Gospel of John. John, just to review a few things, John is a unique gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what we call synoptic gospels. The word synoptic means the same lens. It's like they're all taking, if you imagine them with a camera, taking a picture of Jesus' life, they've got the same lens, they focus a little differently on different things, and they certainly have their own unique approach, but they're basically seeing the events in Jesus' life from the same lens. They used the same sources to write, including and then adding their own spin on it. So that's why when you hear something in Matthew, you think, oh, that's exactly how it is in Mark, or that's also in the Gospel of Luke. It's because of that connection, the relationship. The relationship among those three is a bit of a mystery, but we know that they used similar sources and have that common perspective. The Gospel of John is completely different. While there are a few events that are recorded in all four Gospels, like the baptism of Jesus and the ministry of John the Baptist and the feeding of the 5,000, there's 4 or 5 events that are kind of common, but they're told differently, and the Gospel of John is just completely different. The language is different. The sequence of things is different. The theology is much more developed because it was written later, so which kind of makes sense. When they wrote the Synoptic Gospels, especially Mark, the first Gospel written, it was like, we got to get this written down because we need to tell people about Jesus. And that Peter and Paul and the other apostles were preaching, about Jesus and telling, like we had a bit of Peter's sermon today in the book of Acts. So there's a word for that in the New Testament. It's called the kerygma, the preaching. It's like the content of what they were telling people. Jesus died and rose again, basically, is what they were telling people. And so then, someone like Mark was either probably commissioned to write all this stuff down, and make sure we get this so we can send it out so some of the new churches that are being started all over the world at the time can get the same message about Jesus. So there was an urgency in the synoptic. John now has been sitting with this for a while, and there's been some theology about who Jesus was. And not only is there some theology about it, but there were some people asking questions like, wait a minute, would you say Jesus was God and he just kind of looked like a human? Or was he a human that was just kind of godlike? And so that question really dominated the theology of the early church. It's where we eventually get our creeds from that discussion, and that's putting it mildly to call it a discussion. It was almost short of a war, to figure these things out. But the Gospel of John is starting to address the idea of who Jesus is. That's why John has the I ams. That's where we find I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. And when Jesus said, I am, he was using a construction in Greek that is clearly connected to God's divine name. When God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, and Moses said, who am I supposed to tell them sent me? What's your name? Because all the gods had names, all the false gods had names, like Baal, and all that stuff. And God said, I am who I am. God didn't fall into the trap of naming himself so that he could be manipulated, like the other gods were. He just said, I am who I am, or I am who I always have been, or I am who I always will be. Some mix of that mystery. And so that I am became so So God said, I'm not going to give you a name. I am who I am. But then they made it a name anyway. They said, okay, your name is I am. And that's not really what God intended, but that's what they did with it. They made it a name. And so that divine name, unspoken by God's people because it was so holy, John puts that in the mouth of Jesus when he says, I am. Okay? And so John is clearly stating that Jesus is God. But John is also trying to say that Jesus is not God who's just kind of pretending to be a man, a human, but that Jesus really is human. And so there are things in the Gospel of John that also emphasize Jesus' humanity. In the midst of all this divine stuff that John gives us, he also gives us a very human Jesus who wept at Lazarus' tomb. Remember? That's from the Gospel of John. When we're going to look at later in just a minute, on the cross, when Jesus says, I thirst, that word of Jesus is only found in the Gospel of John. So those are just a couple of examples of John showing us the humanity of Jesus. So the Gospel of John is super important. It's said that the theology of John soars above the synoptic Gospels. It's so lofty and beautiful and wonderful. And so, what I want to do today, we're going to look at the video of the second half of John, but before we look at it, I wanted to point out to you some unique features of, first of all, the Passion story in the Gospel of John, and secondly, the Easter stories in the Gospel of John. He presents a unique story of Jesus suffering and dying and also rising again. So, first difference that has really bothered a lot of people is the timing of Passover in relationship to Jesus' death and Holy Week. The synoptics, of course, place the timing of, and we're not going to get hung up on too much of the details of this because it can get very tricky, but I'm going to oversimplify it. In the synoptics, Passover takes place on Thursday. That's why when they gather together, what meal did they have? The Passover meal, right? That was what they were celebrating, according to the synoptics, the Passover meal. So the timing was Thursday. In John's Gospel, he very clearly states that the Passover was on Friday. So they would not have been having a Passover meal on Thursday night, okay? But rather the Passover was on Friday. John's purpose is to show Jesus as the sacrificial lamb. Okay? So they have different purposes in how they tell the story. Now, people have done, in my mind, silly things trying to combine these two things and to make it fit. Okay? So a couple of things about that. That is not necessary to do that. Okay? The only reason we would do that and try to mesh these two stories and make them fit, even though they seem to be saying something different about the timing, is because it makes us feel better. God, who is revealing himself to us in this word, does not need us to defend the writing of these words. Okay? He does not need that. It is God's purpose and the purpose of these authors to reveal Jesus to us. So, is the Lord's Supper connected to the Passover meal? Do we celebrate those connections? Yes. What a gift that is to make those connections. That meal that the Old Testament people had, this meal of deliverance and freedom, of identification as God's people, leading to the promised land. That's what we have in the Lord's Supper. That's so important, right? Is Jesus the Passover lamb that fulfills everything that the Passover was about? Yes. So we need both these things, and it's okay that they don't match together. They're different authors, and they have different purposes. All right? And so this ought not to worry us. In fact, to me, it is exciting. Makes studying the Scriptures, I think, delightful to say, wow, John did this on purpose because he wanted to reveal something to us. The synoptics did this. They told the story this way on purpose because They weren't just concerned about making sure all the facts and the dates and the times were right, but they wanted us to believe in Jesus and to have life in his name. That's John's purpose in his gospel. So, Chris, you're going to say something.
I think it's just always fascinating. And my question is, do you think, is there ever in history any that you're aware of, anyone like in 100 AD, when they just got John's gospel, that would have said, hey, John, this detail that you got that Matthew, Mark, and Luke recorded for us, they would have had that already, right? They would have had that, because John's writing it 20, 30 years later.
Yeah.
Do you know if anyone would have said, that this particular detail about the timing of whether it was Passover Eve or Passover?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's what I'm asking, but I'm kind of speculating that the people that received his gospel would have been like totally fine with that.
Yes.
They knew, because in our culture, recording history is with a camera.
Yes.
And with exact details from what happened, like a newspaper story, or that's not how they were. It's not the mindset of their culture. And so if you said, well, they probably didn't object to it very much back at that time, to me that would sort of support that I'm just in a different mindset about how I think about how the messages were communicated than they were 2,000 years ago.
Exactly. I think that to suggest that maybe somebody would have called John on the inaccuracy.
Yes.
Misunderstands the nature of oral history.
Right.
And yeah, they would not have been as concerned as we are in the scientific age, of accuracy in that sense. They were extremely accurate about who Jesus was.
Right.
And that's what their purpose was. They were not concerned with dates and times like we would be today. Doug?
Yeah, I heard a theory about extended timelines, where the timelines actually a lot further extended.
Sure. Yep. There's all kinds of things that people use to try to feel good about this. I say, let it be there. Just let that tension and that, because without that, we lose the important part of it in what they're trying to tell us. If we erase this tension, because when we are confronted with it, we go, oh, wow, there is something going on. They're trying to tell me something. And that's when we discover these things, when we let the story reveal itself. I have a problem sometimes when I watch a movie, especially if it's a spy thriller or something like that. It's right from the beginning, I'm like, wait a minute, who is this person? Wait, I don't understand what they're doing. I have to understand it all. And sometimes I just have to remind myself, God, just let them tell you the story. Just let it be revealed to you. And so that's how we must approach Scripture. Just let it be revealed to you. Just let it be told to you. Our defense of God's Word has nothing to do with trying to iron out apparent inconsistencies. Okay? There's no inconsistency in this theology and storytelling. See?
Apart from the Gospels, when was Passover traditionally held? Did it flip between Thursday and Friday?
It was based on the moon cycle and things like this, and the Jewish calendar. And I'm not prepared to. Of Nisan or whatever like that. Yeah, there was a date that had to do with the Jewish calendar that was based on lunar cycles and stuff. That's why Easter is always a different day. Don't get Mary started on Easter. She thinks it should always be the second Sunday of April or something like that. We have this floating date. That's because of an attempt by the church to try to somehow relate it to Passover. So Easter is always the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox, after the first day of spring.
I was just thinking that if Passover was traditionally understood to be a particular day, let's say like a Thursday, and John comes in and puts it on Friday, then it's very clear what you said earlier, which is he's trying to place Christ in the story as the sacrifice.
So the Thursday, Friday part would not have been
So
related
it
to.
wouldn't matter to people,
Right.
because they'd be like, oh, we see what he's doing.
It wasn't a day of the week, it would have been a date. Just like Christmas is on a different day of the week. It would have been counted. All right, that was a lot. Anybody else have anything on that? In the Gospel of John, when they gather in the upper room, there is no Lord's Supper recorded in the Gospel of John. John gives us the washing of feet. The other synoptics do not give us the foot washing. Only John gives us the foot washing and no Lord's Supper. There's also in the Gospel of John, chapters 13 through 17, 13, 14, 15, 16, 5 chapters of John. It's only, 24 chapters, right? 21 chapters. Okay, 5 chapters are Jesus talking to his disciples in the upper room on what we call Maundy Thursday. Things like, I'm going there to prepare a place for you, do not let your hearts be troubled. You know, all these very familiar, wonderful things, Jesus talking to his disciples, took place in the upper room, but no mention of the Lord's Supper. John has, on the other hand, in John chapter 10, a very lengthy discourse on, I am the bread of life. Whoever eats my body and drinks my blood will have life in them. And so forth. It goes on and on and on. In fact, the lectionary has 3, I think maybe even kind of 4 Sundays where we have readings from John chapter 10. It is a preacher's nightmare because it's like, how many times can I preach about Jesus being the bread of life in a row? But that's how much John gives to Jesus as the bread of life. So that is kind of his Lord's Supper. It's not a historical event. It's the theology of Jesus as the bread of life. Okay? So that is a distinctive part of John's Passion story. John has, and every Good Friday when I read the Passion according to John, I did it again this year. I go home and say to John, I can't get over how much Pilate wanted to let Jesus go. Okay? Because in the Gospel of John is much more dialogue with Pilate. First he goes in there, then he goes and sits out here, then he brings Jesus in again, then he has his, all of these different things. And he keeps saying to them, I don't find any basis for a charge. He's done nothing wrong. I'm going to let him go. And they say, no. So there's much more of the dialogue with Pilate. The flip side of this is that the Gospel of John has been used in the wrong hands with the wrong motive to try to pin the blame of Jesus' death on the Jews. Because when you read the Gospel of John, when you hear it, it's definitely the Jewish leaders that call for his death. Pilate was trying to let him go. And then they say, let his blood be on us and on our children. And that line has become so controversial in defending anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and just so many horrors in human history based on a misunderstanding of the role of the Jews in Jesus' death. Jesus' death was a result of a broken world and sinful humanity, period. And so it ought never to, of course, be used to blame the Jews. But John's Gospel is often used in the wrong hands, as I said, for that.
We should also remember Jesus also said, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, not in the Gospel of John, though.
No, but I mean that's...
Yeah. Yes, he did say that. All right, the words of Jesus. So there's 7 last words, right? One of those words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why are you forsaken me, is in Mark and Matthew. That's it. That's the one they have. Luke has Father, forgive them. It has Jesus talking to the man crucified next to him. Today you will be with me in paradise, and into your hands I commit my spirit. John has these words of Jesus. I thirst. Okay. Also the words to Mary and the one Jesus loved. Remember, John, that's his self-reference in the Gospel of John, is the disciple Jesus loved. And so John places himself at the cross in his Gospel. with Jesus speaking to him, giving him, custody, so to speak, of his mother, right? You're familiar with those words. And then the very familiar words, it is finished. So we have this triumphant Jesus on the cross. John speaks about the glory of the cross. Jesus said, I will be lifted up, and this is how he will be glorified. And so John gives us this, loud voice, it is finished. It's this triumph in the Gospel of John. So those 3 words of Jesus, of those 7, are from the Gospel of John. And then John also has these details. It was because, it says the next, because they were going to break their bones to hasten their deaths. Okay? Because when their bones are broken, they can no longer, support their body, and their body drops, and they die by asphyxiation, basically. But when they came to Jesus, you'll remember, they saw that he was already dead, and so they didn't break his bones. So there's a couple, why did he include this? Could it be because of this idea of it being a sacrificial lamb, and so the sacrificial lamb in the Old Testament could have been broken bones? Okay, maybe. It also indicates that Jesus gave his life. He laid his life down. In the Gospel of John, it says, I lay it down, nobody takes it from me. I lay it down on my own accord. So the fact that Jesus was already dead indicates that he had laid his life down. They didn't have to hasten his death. So John includes that. Also includes the spear and the blood and the water that gushed out. And then in the Gospel of John, the author, John, says, the person who saw this himself, okay, because he was there, who saw this testifies so you can believe that this is true. And so there's an emphasis on the testimony of John, who was at the cross, seeing this blood and water gush out. Remember that John is also the one who talks about eternal life and the flowing life. Like when he talked to the woman at the well in Samaria, that's from the Gospel of John, I would give you everlasting life. John 3:16, he who believes will have eternal life. So does the blood and water, is that an indicator of the life-giving waters that we find in Jesus' death? Perhaps. But that is a unique feature of John's passion. Okay, anything about any of those? There's more too, but these are the main things, or the things that I think are most important.
Yeah, something you said about Jesus at death the moment he died. I mean, John says he gave up his spirit.
Yeah, right.
He gave up his spirit.
He laid it down.
Yes. So, and I think I've heard other people say that in his conversations with Pilate also, it was pretty clear that
no one can take it from him.
And Jesus was really claiming to be in charge.
Yeah.
I mean, even though he was about to be crucified, he really had control of the situation. And
Jesus is very triumphal and
in charge.
Yeah. The suffering of Jesus is somewhat de-emphasized in the Gospel of John, and you have more of that. All right. The resurrection story. There's a few unique features here. This Easter, we had the story of Mary Magdalene at the tomb. John tells us that part of the story. He does not have the women going to the tomb with spices. Mary apparently did not come with any spices or to do any burial custom. She was just there. And we have that interaction, that personal encounter that Jesus had with Mary. Also, as part of that story, we have John and Peter. Remember, they raced to the tomb. And John got there first, so you have this lumbering Peter, who couldn't quite make it, and John kind of was a sprinter. And so, and then it says that John looked into the tomb, and he saw the emptiness. He saw the linens. He saw the head covering folded up by itself, and he believed. What did he believe? I don't know, but he believed something. And so we have that story, part of the story, on Easter morning. Then we have kind of the double story of Jesus' appearance to the disciples on Easter evening when he came and said, "Peace be with you," and showed them his hands and feet, and commissioned them to forgive sins, breathed on them his spirit. And then we have the second episode, or second part of that story is the next week when Thomas was there and he showed him his hands and feet, right? That story, that double story, occurs only in the Gospel of John. And then the third Easter story we have is Jesus' appearance on the lake shore, where he was on the shore. They were out fishing, kind of going back to their normal thing. And Jesus says, you haven't caught anything, have you? We're like, no. And so, try the other side. And they bring in this big haul of fish, 153 fish, John tells us. I guess they counted them.
And they were this long.
Yeah.
That's when Ludafish came.
And they thought Jesus was a ghost. All this failure to recognize Jesus after Easter is it's almost comical. But anyway, that story, and then Jesus made them breakfast on the lake shore. That's a unique part of John's Easter story. Any question about this? We're getting kind of late here, and I want to make sure we get to the
That
video.
almost makes it more believable if they would have said, well, of course right away we believed it.
Yeah. That's true. Nobody believed it right away. Nobody.
As soon as the women came, we were like, yeah, of
Oh,
course.
yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Right, yeah. I knew it all along. Yeah, nobody did that. Nobody came close to doing that.
And the reinstatement of Peter, such as
Yes, that's part of this as well. Feed my sheep, feed my lambs, yeah. Any other question or comment about this? All right. Well, let's watch the video. The video is going to cover the second half of John's Gospel. Oh, wait, does everybody have one of these?
The Gospel according to John. In the first video, we saw that John wrote this book to make the claim that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the human embodiment of God's word and glorious presence, who has come to reveal who God truly is. Then we explored how John designed the first half of the book to demonstrate this claim. Jesus performed miraculous signs and made huge claims about himself, that he is the reality to which Israel's entire history points. And this all generates controversy, however, and the Jewish leaders confront Jesus for all these claims, and it culminated with Jesus laying down his life for his friend Lazarus. By going near Jerusalem to raise him from the dead, Jesus sealed his fate. And so once the plot to murder Jesus is set in motion, we come into the book's second half. The first part focuses entirely on Jesus' final night and last words to the disciples, as he tries to prepare them for his coming death. Jesus performs this shocking act at dinner. He takes on the role of a common servant by kneeling down to wash their dirty feet, something that in their culture a superior rabbi would never do for his disciples. And Jesus says it's a symbol of his entire life purpose, to reveal the true nature of God as a being of self-giving love. And it's also a symbol of what Jesus is about to do in becoming a servant and giving up his life to die for the sins of the world. And so this act leads to his great command to his disciples that they are to follow him by loving one another as he has loved them. Acts of loving generosity are to be the hallmark of Jesus' followers. This is what will show the world who Jesus is, and therefore who God is. Now from here, Jesus goes into a long flowing speech that's concluded with a prayer. And you'll find the whole thing is unified by a few repeated themes. Jesus keeps saying that he's going away, which makes the disciples sad, but Jesus says it's for the best because it means that he will send the Spirit, also known as the Advocate. As a human, Jesus can only be in one place at a time, but the Spirit can be Jesus' divine personal presence in any place at any time. And the Spirit will do a number of things, Jesus says. So remember, for John, the unique deity of the one God consists of that loving, unified relationship between the Father and the Son. Jesus says the Spirit is that loving personal presence that will come to live in his people and draw them into the love between the Father and the Son. And so, Jesus says, his disciples are the ones who abide or remain in that divine love, the way that branches are connected to a vine. He's describing here how the personal love of God can permeate a person's life, healing, transforming, and making them new. And there's more. The Spirit will also empower Jesus' followers to carry on his mission in the world. To first of all, fulfill the great command to love others through radical acts of service. But also, Jesus says, the mission is to bear witness to the truth, to expose and name the selfish, sinful ways that we as humans treat each other, and to declare that in Jesus, God has saved the world through him because he loves it. He's opened up a new way to become human again. And so finally, Jesus predicts that there will be opposition. Just as the Jewish leaders rejected him, so his followers will be persecuted. But he tells them not to be afraid because he has already conquered or gained victory over the world. Now, what does Jesus mean by victory here? He doesn't say. But it leads us into the final section of the book where John shows us what victory looks like, Jesus style. The Jewish leaders send soldiers to Jesus and his disciples to arrest him. And when the soldiers ask which one Jesus is, he declares, "I am," and they fall backward. Now this is brilliant on John's part. These words are the culmination of 2 sets of 7 instances where Jesus has used that very phrase. And it all highlights one of John's core claims about Jesus. The words "I am," or in Greek ego eimi, they're the Greek translation of the Hebrew personal covenant name of God that was revealed to Moses back in Exodus chapter 3. It was also repeated many times in Isaiah. And John has strategically placed 7 moments in his story where Jesus says, "I am," followed by some astounding claim. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, the gate for the sheep, the good shepherd, the resurrection, the way, the truth, and the life, the true vine. And John's also designed 7 other stories that have key moments where Jesus says simply, "I am," echoing this divine name. And so here, this occurrence as Jesus is arrested, it's the ironic climax of all of them, because Jesus reveals his divine name and power and victory precisely at the moment that he gives up his life. After this, Jesus is put on trial for his exalted claims to be the Son of God and the King of Israel, first before the high priest and then before the Roman governor Pilate, who has to take seriously anyone who's charged with claiming to be the King of Israel. And Jesus tells Pilate that "my kingdom is not from this world," meaning that he is a king and that his kingdom is for this world, but it's radically different value system, its redefinition of power and greatness. None of this is derived from this world. Rather, they are defined by God's character that Jesus has revealed through his upside-down kingdom, which is epitomized by the cross. It's the place where the world's true king conquers sin and evil by letting it conquer him. And Jesus gains victory over the world through an act of self-giving love. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb that is then sealed. And on the first day of the week, Mary and then later the other disciples discover that the tomb is strangely open and then empty. And then Mary, all of a sudden, she meets Jesus. He's alive from the dead. Now, the resurrection of Jesus connects back to another pattern of 7s in John's gospel. So all the way back at the wedding party in Cana, when Jesus turned the water into wine, John told us that that was Jesus' first sign. And he also identified the second sign, the healing of the sick boy in chapter 4. But after this, John just lets you keep count. And if you have, you'll have noticed that the 6th sign was the raising of Lazarus from the tomb, which Jesus performed at the cost of his own life. And so that, and all of the signs, they point forward to this 7th and greatest sign at the culmination of the story, Jesus' own resurrection from the dead. It vindicates Jesus' claim to be the Son of God, the author of all life, whose love has conquered death itself. After the empty tomb, Jesus then meets up with all the disciples, and he commissions them by sending the Spirit as he promised, so that his mission from the Father can now be carried on through them. After this, the book concludes with an epilogue that explores the ongoing mission of Jesus' disciples in the world. So a number of them are fishing, and they're not catching anything. And so Jesus appears to them on the shore. They don't recognize him, though. And he tells them to cast their net on the other side of the boat. And when they obey him, they catch a huge amount of fish, and it's only then that they recognize him as Jesus. Now, John's offering here a picture of discipleship to Jesus. His followers will be most effective in the world when their focus is not on their work as such, but on simply listening for Jesus' voice and obeying him when he speaks. That's when they will truly see him at work in their lives. After this, Jesus talks with Peter and then commissions him as a unique leader in the Jesus movement, indicating that he too will give up his life one day. But in contrast to Peter, the last moments of the story focus on the author of this gospel, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And unlike Peter, his job was not to lead the Jesus movement, but rather to spend his long life bearing witness to Jesus so that others might believe in him. And that's actually what he's done right here by authoring this amazing story about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And that's what the Gospel of John is all about.
Okay. I was going to mention one other thing when I said that John didn't have the Lord's Supper, but he had the bread of life. He also has the miracle of the water turning into wine. So he's got bread and wine, you know, in the narrative, but not in the Lord's Supper. Okay. Question for us. What stands out to you when you hear John's perspective on Jesus' death and resurrection?
I think that he's in charge.
Okay, so the kind of the triumphant in charge Jesus, and going through this as an act of, as they said, self-giving love, but doing it on his own accord, his own terms, on purpose, that kind of thing. Okay, Bruce.
Well, it's kind of like he's saying, I was there, and this is what happened.
Yeah.
This is what he said, this is what I said, this is what they said. Kind of different from the other Gospels. He's more like, hey, this is a first-hand account, pay attention.
Yeah. John does that more than the others. You know, even though, you know, you might say there was some eyewitness accounts that were used in the synoptics, but John does say, hey, the person who saw this wrote it down. I wrote these things down so you would believe. And, you know, yeah, he definitely places himself in the story as many times as an eyewitness. Okay? Franklin.
I wonder if some of the manipulation with Pilate and Pilate trying more to release Jesus than the synoptics has to do with it being written later, because, okay, we've now had the fall of Jerusalem, we've had the Nero persecution, and they're beginning the Domitian persecution. You know, maybe it's sort of, okay, let's back off the Romans a little bit, put the blame on the Jewish authorities to try to back the Roman authorities off of us.
Mm-hmm. Possibly. Yeah. Doug.
Do you think this is what John felt was important? Jesus might have said more things than that, but this is what he felt John was important.
Yeah. I mean, he says that. I wrote these things. These things are written that you may believe. Because he said Jesus did a lot of other things. He didn't write them all down. But these things are written so that you might believe. So the author's intent is clear in writing it. Harlan.
I like how he makes peace with Peter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
After denying him 3 times, now he goes back and shows him.
The threefold kind of reinstatement to correspond to a 3 times denial, you know. Yeah, Chris?
Just sort of the literary, the composition of the gospel. Like, this is a work telling a story. You know, and you know the 7 included 3 different times. That structure, what John's trying to say is just so amazing. This is a work. This is an inspired work of. It's just a masterpiece. You know, what he's trying to put together and tell us, and trying to communicate on so many different levels with the structure and pulling back into Israel's story, and just kind of. It's just amazing the structure. So that's one thing that stood out to me. And the second thing is on number 13 on the sheet here. Marks of generosity are to be the hallmark of Jesus' followers. That John doesn't focus so much on the preaching and communion stuff. It talks about how we're to be recognized by acts of generosity and I think we miss that sometimes in the church. So.
Oh, we have so misrepresented God in so many ways, haven't we? Yeah. And said, this is what it's about to be a follower of Jesus. This is what it's about this is what kind of God we have. And it's like, where did you come up with that? Because that's nowhere in the gospel. I love the first point you made about the fact that John is such a literary masterpiece. Can you see, I know you can you see how there's a difference between seeing these biblical, you know, inerrant texts that dropped out of the sky that we must kind of now sort through and fit them all together into something to make us feel better about them. Contrast that approach to embracing these Gospels and these these works of narrative and prophecy and all these things as works of genius, and that they have their own beauty and delight. And when we try to erase all those things, it robs the piece of writing of its impact. We are to stand, just like you were saying, it's so amazing. We need to stand back and just take delight in them and let it tell us the story to us, let it reveal itself to us.
And one additional comment on top of that is that at the same time, John is saying, I saw this. I mean, at the time he's creating this thing, he's also saying, I am a witness to this.
Yeah.
You know, and so are many others.
Mm-hmm.
So both. That's just amazing.
Yes. Anybody else?
It's personal. It makes it very personable and personal. The humility in which it's all described and talked about. I mean, John could have, because he was a witness, could have had an arrogance about it, reporting it. But it's all done in humility so that others might accept it, receive it, believe it.
And that is probably something, I'm reading a lot in between the lines, but you know, so if John was an older man when he wrote this, if it was in the 90s AD, you know, John's maybe the only surviving disciple and he's an old man, I think he must have learned that humility and must have mellowed out, because we ought not to forget that it was John and his brother James who, when Jesus was talking about his upcoming crucifixion, said, we would like to sit at your right and left hand in the kingdom. That was John. So, you know, people change. We evolve, right? And we learn this. So
and also by keeping it where he's basically anonymous, you know, using the pseudonym. It's keeping the focus on Jesus and not on him. So, okay, yeah, I'm an eyewitness, but I'm not going to brag about it. The whole focus is Jesus.
And he's not really emphasizing in that sense the eyewitness part as much as who he is in relationship to Jesus. I'm the one Jesus loved. You know. By the way, John's gospel does not tell the story of James and John asking for. Okay, anybody else? All right. Was wondering about if you are able to detect John's use of these things that seem to me to be kind of hallmarks of John's gospel. For example, the personal encounters with Jesus, the emphasis on Jesus' humanity and Jesus as a source of life. Are you able to, just in a couple minutes here, detect how John is using that in telling the story? For example, personal encounter.
He's using that to sort of as a device to maybe spread out Jesus' discourses on the theology.
Yeah, okay. I mean, from his own identification to the stories that he chooses to tell, these are all very personal things. Nicodemus he met with at night, you know, that personal connection. The woman at the well, and Mary and Martha and Lazarus, those personal relationships. Mary Magdalene at the tomb, that personal, saying her name. I mean, he's using that. John is using those personal encounters to tell the story, because remember, his purpose is that you would have a personal encounter with Jesus, and that you would believe, and by believing in him, have life in his name. So he's using all of these personal stories and encounters to project onto you, the reader and the listener. You can have one of these too. Jesus is here to do this with you, to offer this to you. Anybody else? We're really, I'm sure I have time, so maybe that'll have to be the end of it. But any other last minutes, comments or questions?
Well, I would say the miracles show Jesus is the source of life.
Yes.
Water and wine and feeding and healing and.
Yep. Opening eyes.
Taking away fear, doubt, sending.
Well, ultimately, literally, with two resurrections.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Very good. Anybody else? All right, so again, next week, we'll have to put a pause on our Bible study because we won't be here. But then the 2 weeks after that, we're going to continue on with a couple more times to dig into some of the theology of John's Gospel with a couple